Hey Riverside, Zach here. We're just continuing on our journey, working our way through the Gospel Fluency Handbook. So far, we've had two sections that we've kind of done an overview on. The very first section was the Gospel in me. Then our last section was the Gospel in us. And now our last section of the book that we're going to start talking about today is the Gospel to others. So Jeff kind of talks about evangelism a little bit in this section and sharing the gospel and what that might look like. I kind of am a little bit blessed in a way and maybe cursed in another way. I don't know. I feel like my whole life, which I was a believer from a very, very young child, I've kind of had this evangelistic mindset, and I don't know if it's specifically something the Lord gifted me with, or if it was just how I was raised. I was a missionary kid. My dad constantly was just drilling into me the importance of sharing the gospel. So I don't know, this kind of imperative to share the gospel has always been kind of a big thing in my life and on my heart. And man, like growing up as a kid, I would try to do this so much. I would try to share the gospel, but it was so difficult. And I think that a lot of people, even myself included, to this day, view these kind of gospel situations where you have the opportunity to share the gospel with someone and look at it as a really daunting thing, because you don't know how that message is going to be received. So the kind of fear of rejection and kind of the importance and weightiness of the message, I think can be really intimidating sometimes. I saw a quote on Facebook just by kind of like an acquaintance just yesterday, actually. The quote that he wrote on Facebook, I think he was just saying it. He said, "Sharing the gospel sounds like hate speech to those who don't want to hear it." Sharing the gospel sounds like hate speech to those who don't want to hear it. I read this on Facebook, and I thought to myself, that's not right. That's not right. Whether a person is working their way to belief or not, the gospel should sound like good news. The gospel should never sound like hate speech. So this kind of sent off red flags in my head when I heard this. And it's really interesting because it works really, really well into what Jeff's kind of talking about in today's chapter. So the first thing Jeff kind of talks about is the practice of listening. He says that some of the greatest communicators that exist in the world aren't good speakers, but are good listeners. And we have the opportunity as believers to listen both upward to the Spirit and outward to other people. And I think that like one of the main issues that I've had sharing the gospel in my entire life, and kind of the struggles that I've had and some of the challenges that I've had, and fears even, are all because I wasn't listening to the person that I was talking to. So I think that listening both to the Spirit and to others is one of the main keys to sharing the gospel well. We have to cultivate a listening culture in our lives in order to share the gospel. The proverb says that a wise person knows how to draw out of the deep waters of a person's heart. So if you're talking to someone and you're wise, you're able to draw these deep, deep longings and hurts and desires out of a person's heart. And how do you do that? Well, you do that by asking really good questions, right? But you can't ask really good questions if you're not listening first. So listening is really the key to kind of knowing where someone's coming from, knowing the position someone's in, so that you can know kind of the status of where their heart is at. I think that one of the greatest kind of gifts you can give to the people around you is listening to them. It's just closing your mouth and opening your ears and hearing out what they have to say. And I think that when you do, people start to reveal some of those things deep within their heart. They start to reveal their deepest fears, their deepest desires, their struggles, their pains. And when they start to share these things with you, that is when you can begin to speak the gospel into their lives in such specific ways, in ways that the gospel can be nothing but good news to them. The good news should sound like good news. It should not ever sound like hate speech. And it's our job to deliver this good news to people. It's the Spirit's job to work on these people's hearts. The Spirit is going to be transforming people's hearts. We don't have to worry about that. We don't have to worry about this end result. But God has given us this great commission, right? We have this job, we have this obligation to be sharing the good news with people. And we have to listen to them first if we're going to know how to apply the gospel to their lives. Now you might be thinking to yourself, well, Zach, if they're not a regenerate person, if their heart hasn't been changed by the Spirit, right? The gospel is not going to sound so great to them. You're basically telling them, well, if you don't believe, you're going to go to hell. But really, the gospel should never sound like bad news to them. If you're listening to what they have to say and you present the gospel to them in an area of their life that they are hurting, that they are damaged, that they need help, the gospel is going to sound like good news to them, whether they're on the road to belief or not. We have to share it so that it sounds like good news, because it is good news. Francis Schaeffer, and this is kind of a loose quote by him, he says this kind of interesting thing. He's talking about, if I just had an hour to sit down with someone and help them to understand what Jesus did for them, he says he would spend the first 55 minutes asking good questions and listening to what they had to say. And then he would spend the last 5 minutes sharing the gospel to their specific needs. He understands that we need to be listening to people. We need to figure out where people are at in order for the gospel to be speaking to them in a way that sounds like good news to them. We have to cultivate this listening culture, both to the Holy Spirit and to other people. And then, once we do that, we have to not only share the good news with these people, but we have to show the good news to these people. I want to read you a passage out of 1 Peter 2, 9 through 12. 1 Peter 2, verse 9. But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his own possession, that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. Once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. Beloved, I urge you as sojourners and exiles to abstain from the passions of the flesh, which wage war against your soul. Keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable, so that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of salvation. So what's Peter saying here? He's basically saying two things. He's saying, one, you need to be sharing with the people around you. You need to be sharing what God has done, what Jesus has done on the cross to people around you. But he's also saying you need to be showing them what he's done tangibly. You need to be showing how this message has changed your life so that they have no way of expressing that what you're saying isn't true. It has to be congruent. There has to be a common line. One of the biggest complaints people have against Christians, right, is their hypocrisy. That's one of the biggest complaints people say. And obviously, it's easy to understand, right? We're imperfect people. We struggle all the time with being hypocrites, with being sinners. But we have the Spirit within us, and we have the ability to not sin. So we need to be striving toward this. We need to be striving toward loving others well, and showing them what Jesus has done, not only telling them what Jesus has done. We have to live our life in a way that it demands a gospel explanation. We have to live our life in a way that demands a gospel explanation. We have to live in our life in a way that our lives are metaphors kind of the gospel. That we have all of these different ways that we're living that are just pointing to Jesus constantly in all of these different ways. Jeff tells this story that I kind of think touches on all of these elements, the ideas of listening, the ideas of showing the gospel to others, and the ideas of sharing the gospel with others. He tells this story early on when he was starting his church in Tacoma, Washington. On Sunday, he was having a brunch with some of his neighbors. And they were all unbelievers because all of the believers were in church services at this time on a Sunday. And he was having brunch at his house with his neighbors, and they began to talk about his neighbor who was across the street. This neighbor across the street had a no parking sign without permit in front of his house on the street. So it was really hard to see this sign. There were no other signs on the street, so no one was really looking for a no parking sign. It wasn't lit up at night, so it was easy to miss. So people oftentimes would park in front of his house on this in front of this no parking sign. And what he would do is, if someone parked in front of his house, in his rage, in his anger that they're violating his rules, he would take a piece of paper, put glue all over it, and stick it to their windshield. And then when they would get in their car, they would look and they would see this paper, and written on it was like, "Don't you know how to read, stupid?" and a bunch of other expletives, just kind of like a really nasty paper. So obviously this guy wasn't the most popular guy in town. So the neighbors started talking about this guy, and just kind of really tearing him down, really laying into what he was like. And he wasn't there. He wasn't at this brunch. So Jeff was like, "Guys, can we just pause here for a moment and not talk about this guy? I'm sure it's a hard time for him." And they didn't really understand where Jeff was coming from. They did kind of stop talking about it at the time just because Jeff asked them to, but they were like, "Okay, what the heck? Like, this guy is clearly a mean guy, you know?" So then a couple days passed, and one of those neighbors who was at the brunch came up to Jeff. She was like, "Jeff, I've been thinking about it, and I just can't figure out, like, why on earth would you defend that guy? Why would you stand up for that guy?" And this was the gospel opportunity for Jeff. So Jeff was like, "Listen, the reason that I did that was because that's exactly what Jesus is doing for me right now. He is in heaven interceding for me to the Father on my behalf in a place that I can't be. He's standing up for me even though I don't deserve it." So he was able to take this, the way he was living in standing up for this guy, and he was able to actually use that as a perfect gospel illustration. It was a perfect gospel metaphor. The crazy thing was, him and his wife had met with this guy and actually had dinner with this guy a few days before, and they actually knew that like a lot of this stuff that he was doing was coming from pain in his life, and he was able to share that with his neighbor as well. So this was just an awesome gospel opportunity for Jeff, but really it kind of demonstrates all of these aspects that he's teaching in this section about how he listened. He was listening to what his neighbor was saying, hearing the hurts of this mean neighbor across the street. And then he was showing, when he had this opportunity to gossip, he was showing what it's like to stand up for someone who doesn't deserve it, right? And then he was able to tell, he was able to share, he was able to proclaim to his neighbor the truths of the gospel, when the only possible explanation for his actions was his changed heart, was the gospel and how it changed his life. And that's how we want to live. That's where we want to be, church. We want to be in a place where when people see our lives, There is literally no other explanation. It's so weird how we're living that there is no explanation other than a life changed by the gospel. So I encourage you guys, listen to others. Listen to where other people are coming from. Listen before you talk. Do a majority job of listening to people. And then show them the gospel. Live your life in a way that Jesus is just exuding from you. Really live your life in a way that you are a metaphor for the gospel. And then lastly, share the gospel with others through your words. Guys, thanks for joining me again. I look forward to seeing you next week.